What happens when someone finally admits the truth after 3 decades of lies, and the revelation is so devastating that even Dr. Phil has to stop the cameras? Stop the tape. Stop it right now. Dr. Phil's voice cut through the studio like a knife. The woman in the chair was trembling, her hands covering her face, and in that moment, everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something that would change everything. But how did we get here? How does someone live a lie for 30 years? 2 hours earlier, the Dr. Phil show had begun like any other taping. The audience filed in, the cameras were set, and the crew ran their final checks. The episode was titled, Family Secrets That Destroy. On paper, it seemed straightforward, a family dealing with trust issues, resentment, and years of unspoken tension. The guest was Margaret, a 52-year-old woman from Ohio. She had been brought on the show by her daughter, Jessica, who was 28. The official reason: Margaret had been emotionally distant for Jessica's entire life, and Jessica wanted answers about why her mother had never truly bonded with her. Dr. Phil walked onto the stage to his usual applause, shook hands with Margaret, and sat down in his chair. The cameras started rolling. Everything was normal. Margaret, your daughter tells me that you've been cold to her since she was born. Dr. Phil began, his tone measured and professional. She says she's never felt like you actually wanted to be her mother. Help me understand what's going on here. Margaret sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She nodded slowly. It's complicated, Dr. Phil. Well, we've got time, he replied gently. Jessica deserves to understand. You deserve to be heard. So let's talk about it. But what Dr. Phil didn't know was that he was about to hear something that no amount of professional experience could have prepared him for. Margaret started slowly. She talked about her marriage to Jessica's father, David. She talked about how they had struggled to conceive. She talked about the pressure from both families to have children. Standard family therapy territory. Dr. Phil listened, nodding, asking follow-up questions. The audience was engaged but not particularly riveted. This felt like a typical episode about familial dysfunction and communication breakdown. Then Dr. Phil asked a simple question. Margaret, when Jessica was born, what did you feel? Margaret's face changed. It was subtle, but Dr. Phil saw it. 30 years of reading people had given him an almost supernatural ability to detect when someone was hiding something significant. I don't know how to answer that, Margaret said quietly. Just tell me the truth, Dr. Phil said, leaning forward slightly. No judgment. Just truth. What did you feel when you first held your daughter? The studio went completely silent. Margaret's hands began to shake. She looked at the floor, then at the audience, then back at Dr. Phil. Her mouth opened, then closed. She was wrestling with something enormous. I felt nothing, she whispered. Dr. Phil nodded slowly. Postpartum depression is... No, Margaret interrupted, her voice breaking. It wasn't that. It wasn't postpartum depression. It was... She stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Dr. Phil didn't push. He just waited, his eyes never leaving her face. And then Margaret said it. She's not mine. The words hung in the air like a physical thing. What do you mean, she's not yours? Dr. Phil asked carefully. Jessica isn't my biological daughter, Margaret said, and now the tears were coming. I didn't give birth to her. I've been lying about it for 30 years. The audience gasped audibly. One of the cameras caught Jessica's face in the green room. She was watching on a monitor, and her expression was one of complete shock. That's when Dr. Phil raised his hand and said the words that would make this episode legendary. Stop the tape. Stop it right now. The cameras cut. The red recording lights went dark. The crew looked at each other in confusion. Dr. Phil rarely stopped mid-taping. He stood up, walked over to Margaret, and knelt beside her chair. Margaret, he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Are you telling me that Jessica doesn't know she's adopted? Margaret shook her head, sobbing now. Dr. Phil stood up and looked at his producer. Get Jessica out of the green room. Take her to my office. Do not let her watch any more of this. Get Dr. Charles on the phone, we need a therapist standing by. And get legal on the line. We're not broadcasting any of this until I know exactly what we're dealing with. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The studio was cleared except for Dr. Phil, Margaret, and one cameraman who was instructed to keep filming but not for broadcast. What happened next would only be seen by a handful of people, but it would become the most talked about moment in Dr. Phil history. Dr. Phil sat back down. His demeanor had completely changed. The television host was gone. This was Phil McGraw, the clinical psychologist, the human being. Margaret, I need you to tell me everything, he said. Not for the cameras. Not for the show. For Jessica. She deserves the truth, and you need to give it to her the right way. So start from the beginning. And Margaret did. 30 years ago, Margaret and David had been desperate to have a child. After years of failed attempts and a devastating miscarriage, they had been on the verge of divorce. The strain had broken them. Then David came home one day with news: his sister, Karen, was pregnant. Karen was 17, unmarried, and terrified. She wanted to give the baby up for adoption, but the family was pressuring her to keep it. David proposed something that seemed like a solution. He and Margaret would take the baby. They would raise it as their own. Karen could finish school, go to college, have a life. And Margaret and David would finally have the child they desperately wanted. But there was one condition that would poison everything that came after. Karen insisted that the truth never be revealed. She didn't want to be a mother. She didn't want the child to ever know. She wanted to pretend it had never happened. Margaret and David agreed. They moved to a different state. They told everyone that Margaret was pregnant. They faked doctor's appointments, bought maternity clothes, staged baby shower photos. When Karen gave birth, Margaret and David took the baby and came home with their daughter. Jessica had no idea that her aunt was actually her biological mother. I thought I could do it, Margaret said, her voice raw. I thought I could love her like my own. But every time I looked at her, all I saw was the lie. All I felt was the guilt. I couldn't bond with her because I felt like I was stealing someone else's child, even though Karen gave her to us. I couldn't be the mother she deserved because I was too busy pretending to be something I wasn't. Dr. Phil sat back in his chair. Where is Karen now? She died, Margaret said quietly. Car accident. 10 years ago. She never told anyone. The secret died with her. Or, I thought it did. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. He called Jessica into the studio. Not the green room, not his office, the actual stage. He sat her down in the chair across from her mother. And with Margaret's permission, he told Jessica everything. The next hour was not television. It was raw human emotion. Jessica screamed. She cried. She demanded answers to questions Margaret couldn't answer. She asked about Karen, about the lie, about why no one had ever told her the truth. Dr. Phil didn't play therapist. He played mediator. He let them rage and cry and hurt. He held space for something that couldn't be fixed quickly but needed to start healing. And then he did something that no one expected. He pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket. Jessica, he said quietly, I made some calls. I have Karen's medical records from the hospital where you were born. I have photos that your grandmother kept hidden. I have letters that Karen wrote to you but never sent. Your family thought they were protecting you by keeping secrets. But secrets don't protect people. Truth does. He placed the envelope on the table between Jessica and Margaret. This is yours, he said to Jessica. Everything in here belongs to you. Your history. Your truth. Your mother, Karen, wanted you to have a good life. Margaret tried to give you that life, even though she didn't know how. And now you get to decide what comes next. But what happened next is something no one in the room, or watching at home, saw coming. Jessica picked up the envelope. She held it for a long time, staring at it. Then she looked at Margaret. "I need time," Jessica said. I can't process this right now. But I need you to know something." Margaret looked up, tears streaming down her face. "You did your best," Jessica said. "I'm angry. I'm hurt. I feel like my entire life has been a lie. But I also know that you tried. You weren't a perfect mother, but you were my mother. And I need time to figure out what that means now." The two women didn't hug. They didn't reconcile in a neat bow. But there was a moment, a tiny moment, where they looked at each other and saw the truth for what it was: complicated, painful, and deeply human. Dr. Phil stood and addressed the empty audience seats, speaking directly into the camera that was still rolling. "This episode will never air in its original form," he said. "What you just saw is too raw, too personal. But I'm going to tell you what I told Margaret and Jessica. Living a lie doesn't protect anyone. It only delays the pain. Truth is hard. Truth is messy. But truth is the only thing that can set you free." He paused, looking directly into the lens. "If you're living a lie, no matter how old it is, no matter how complicated, I'm telling you right now, tell the truth. Get help. Find a therapist. Call someone you trust. But don't let the lie live one more day. Because that lie is stealing your life, and it's stealing the lives of everyone around you." Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. In the days following the taping, Dr. Phil arranged for both Margaret and Jessica to receive intensive therapy. He connected them with specialists in family trauma and adoption disclosure. He personally followed up weekly. 3 months later, Jessica agreed to return to the show for a follow-up. She and Margaret sat side by side, not as mother and daughter in the traditional sense, but as two people trying to rebuild something real from the ashes of a lie. Jessica had read Karen's letters. She had looked at the photos. She had learned about the scared 17-year-old girl who had given her life so that Jessica could have a chance. "I understand now," Jessica said on that follow-up episode. "Karen made a choice she thought was best. Margaret made a choice she thought was best. They were both trying to protect me in their own ways. It was wrong to lie. It hurt. But I also understand that they were human beings trying to navigate an impossible situation." Dr. Phil leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "The lesson here isn't about adoption," he said. "It's about truth. Adoption is beautiful. Adoption saves lives. But secrets about adoption destroy lives. Jessica lost 30 years of knowing her full story. Margaret lost 30 years of genuine connection with her daughter. And Karen died never telling her truth. That's what secrets cost." He looked directly at the camera again. "If you're a parent who adopted and haven't told your child, tell them. If you're hiding something from your family because you think it will hurt them less, you're wrong. The truth might hurt today, but the lie will hurt every day for the rest of their lives. The legacy of that stopped recording lives on." The envelope Dr. Phil gave to Jessica became a symbol of reclaiming truth. The moment he stopped the cameras became a reminder that some things are more important than television. Years later, Jessica started a non-profit helping adoptees discover their biological histories. Margaret became an advocate for open adoption and honest communication. The two women never had a traditional mother-daughter relationship, but they built something else, a friendship based on truth, however painful it was to reach. Dr. Phil kept one of Karen's letters in his desk drawer. He never said why, but those who worked with him knew. It was a reminder that behind every episode, every guest, every conflict, there were real human beings carrying real pain. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop the tape, step off the stage, and simply be human with them. The truth had been buried for 30 years. But in one afternoon, in front of cameras that weren't rolling, it finally came to light. And though the road ahead was long and painful, It was a road that could actually lead somewhere real. That's the power of truth. And that's why Dr. Phil stopped the tape. 5 years later, the impact of that moment still resonates. Jessica now speaks at adoption conferences across the country, sharing her story of discovery and healing. The truth didn't destroy me, she tells audiences. The lie almost did. Finding out at 28 was devastating, but imagine finding out at 40, or 60, or never. Dr. Phil gave me the gift of truth when I was still young enough to build a real life with it. Margaret, now in her late 50s, has reconciled with her own past. She volunteers at adoption agencies, counseling prospective parents about the importance of transparency. I wasted 30 years being afraid, she says. I could have been a real mother to Jessica if I hadn't been so busy hiding. The envelope Dr. Phil handed Jessica that day sits in a frame in her home office. Inside were not just medical records and letters, but Karen's handwritten note explaining her decision. I'm giving you to people who desperately want to be parents. I hope someday you'll understand that I loved you enough to let you go. Dr. Phil keeps a photo from that day in his private office, not the staged publicity shots, but a candid moment captured after cameras stopped. Margaret and Jessica sitting in silence, the envelope between them, both women's faces showing the complex mixture of pain and possibility that truth brings. That day taught me something I already knew but needed to remember, Dr. Phil reflected in a later interview. You can't heal what you won't reveal. Those 30 years of distance between Margaret and Jessica? That was the cost of a secret. The pain of truth is sharp but brief. The pain of lies is dull but eternal.